Look at a map of South America today and trace the border of Bolivia. The country sits landlocked in the heart of the continent, surrounded by 5 neighbors, touching no ocean. Now imagine that same map redrawn as it existed in 1825, the year Bolivia claimed independence from Spain. The coastline was there. Hundreds of kilometers of Pacific shore belonged to the young nation, a gift of colonial geography and Spanish imperial reach. Within 60 years, that coastline would be gone, not eroded by time or lost to natural disaster, but seized by war, negotiated away by treaty, and never recovered. The question that shapes this history is not complicated. How does a nation born with access to the sea end up completely cut off from it? The answer begins not with a single dramatic moment, but with a specific resource and the hunger it created. In the 1870s, European demand for nitrate was climbing. The industrial world needed it for explosives, for fertilizers, for the chemical engines of modern warfare and modern agriculture. The richest deposits of nitrate in the Western Hemisphere lay in the Atacama Desert, a vast expanse of salt flats and barren rock that stretched across the border region between Bolivia, Peru, and Chile. This was not treasure buried deep underground. It lay near the surface, ready to be extracted by anyone willing to work the heat and the emptiness. The problem was simple. Which country owned it? Bolivia believed the nitrate fields fell within its territory. Peru made the same claim. So did Chile. 3 nations, 3 claims, 1 desert. What followed was not immediate warfare. Instead, there were decades of diplomatic maneuvering, of border commissions and conflicting maps, of merchants and mining companies operating in the uncertain space between law and theft. Bolivia granted concessions to extract nitrate. Chile granted concessions. Peru granted concessions. The same patches of ground were sold multiple times by multiple governments, each confident that its claim would eventually be upheld. The real tension, though, was not about the nitrate itself. War does not start because countries disagree about who owns a resource. War starts when one nation believes it can take what another nation possesses, and when the price of taking it seems lower than the price of asking permission. By the mid-1870s, Chile had begun to see the nitrate fields not as a disputed zone, but as a prize worth fighting for. Chile's economy was growing, its military was modernizing. Its leadership believed the nation's future lay in controlling Pacific trade routes and the resources that lined them. Peru and Bolivia stood in the way. The immediate crisis arrived in 1879. It came not as a declaration, but as a commercial dispute. Bolivia had imposed a tax on nitrate exports from the Atacama region. The tax was not unreasonable by the standards of the time, but it was a clear assertion of sovereignty. Chile interpreted it as provocation. Peru, bound to Bolivia by treaty, was obligated to defend its ally. The machinery of war, once set in motion, moves faster than diplomacy can follow. What neither Bolivia nor Peru fully understood was that they were not entering a war on equal terms. Chile had spent the previous decades building military capacity with deliberate intention. Its navy was stronger than the combined navies of Peru and Bolivia. Its army was better equipped, better trained, and led by officers with recent combat experience. Bolivia and Peru believed that numbers might compensate for disadvantage. They were mistaken. In warfare between unequal powers, intention counts for less than capacity. The first phase of the conflict moved quickly across the Atacama. Bolivian forces mobilized to defend the nitrate region. They were commanded by officers of varying competence, supplied with equipment that was aging and insufficient, and operating under a leadership structure that had not prepared adequately for sustained military conflict. Within weeks, the pattern became clear. Whenever Bolivian and Chilean forces met directly, the outcome favored Chile. The Bolivian army was not weak by the standards of regional forces, but it was weaker than its opponent, and in the calculus of war, that difference becomes absolute. By late 1879, Bolivia had suffered a series of defeats in the Atacama. The losses were not catastrophic in the immediate sense. No single battle destroyed the Bolivian army. Instead, each engagement revealed the gap between Bolivian military capacity and Chilean capability. Supply lines grew tenuous. Casualties accumulated. The war, which some in Bolivia had imagined lasting weeks or months before diplomatic settlement, showed signs of becoming a prolonged conflict, and prolonged conflict favors the power with greater resources. It was at this moment that Peru's commitment to the alliance began to fracture. Peru had its own strategic interests, distinct from Bolivia's. Peru's territory included not just the disputed Atacama region, but also lands to the south and north. As Chilean forces advanced, Peruvian leadership began calculating whether continuing to fight alongside Bolivia served Peru's interests. The calculus was brutal and clear. If Peru fought on and lost, it would lose territory. If Peru negotiated a separate peace with Chile, it might preserve some advantages. In 1881, Peru opened negotiations with Chile, separate from Bolivia's war effort. The abandonment was not announced as betrayal. It was framed in the language of diplomatic necessity, of realism, of accepting conditions that could not be changed. But to Bolivia, the effect was identical to betrayal. The alliance that had been the foundation of Bolivian military strategy had collapsed. Bolivia now faced Chile alone. What followed was not a glorious last stand, but a slow recognition of inevitable defeat. Bolivian forces continued to fight, but they were fighting without the support of a regional ally, without any realistic prospect of military victory, and without any clear pathway to a negotiated settlement that would preserve Bolivian interests. The war had become a mechanism not for resolving the territorial dispute, but for determining the terms on which Bolivia would surrender. In 1883, that surrender came. Bolivia signed the Treaty of Ancon, ceding to Chile all claims to the Atacama region, and with it, all access to the Pacific Ocean. The nitrate fields, which had seemed like the reason for war, passed into Chilean control, but the deeper consequence was territorial. Bolivia ceased to be a coastal nation. The young republic, born with an ocean, had lost it to 4 years of conflict it was never positioned to win. The isolation was complete. Bolivia stood against Chile without Peru, without allies, without the military machinery to sustain a prolonged conflict across difficult terrain. What had seemed like a manageable regional dispute in 1879 had transformed into an existential crisis for a nation unprepared for the cost of modern warfare. The Bolivian government faced a choice that was no choice at all. They could continue fighting and lose everything gradually, or they could negotiate from a position so weak that the negotiators themselves knew the outcome before talks began. General Narciso Campero, who had led Bolivian forces, understood this calculus. He understood that every month of continued resistance drained resources that could never be replaced, that every battle lost further weakened Bolivia's position in any future negotiation, that the only variable left to control was the timing of capitulation. The Chilean military advantage had become overwhelming. Chile possessed a larger standing army, superior naval capabilities, and access to resources that allowed sustained military operations. Bolivia's economy could not compete. The nitrate fields that had sparked the conflict were now generating revenue for Chile, funding the very military machine that was grinding down Bolivian resistance. This was not merely a war of armies. It was a war of logistics, of industrial capacity, of the ability to sustain conflict across months and years. Bolivia possessed none of these advantages. By 1882, the nature of the conflict had shifted entirely. The question was no longer whether Bolivia could win, but whether the government could survive politically if it continued to lose. The population was exhausted. The army was depleted. The treasury was empty. A government that prolonged suffering for a war it could not win would face internal collapse, even if the external enemy did not defeat it. The diplomatic record from this period reveals men confronting impossible circumstances. Bolivian. Delegates were instructed to preserve as much territory as possible, to maintain some access to the sea if negotiation could achieve it, to extract any concessions that might prevent total territorial loss. They knew these instructions were fantasy. They were negotiating surrender, not settlement. The only authenticity in the process was the recognition that surrender was inevitable and that its terms would be dictated entirely by the victors. Peru, meanwhile, had negotiated its own separate peace with Chile. The Treaty of Ancon, signed between Chile and Peru in October 1883, formalized Peru's exit from the conflict and established the terms by which Peru would lose territory as well. But Peru retained something that Bolivia would not. Peru kept a northern coastal province. Peru's defeat was partial. Bolivia's would be absolute. When Bolivia entered negotiations with Chile in the final months of 1883, the Bolivian delegation knew exactly what was coming. Chile demanded the cession of the entire Atacama region, the nitrate fields, and all territory that provided access to the Pacific coast. Chile offered nothing in return except the cessation of warfare. From Bolivia's perspective, this was extortion. From Chile's perspective, this was the legitimate spoils of victory. On October 20th, 1883, Bolivia signed the Treaty of Ancon. The terms were as brutal as anticipated. Bolivia ceded to Chile all territory comprising the nitrate-rich province of Antofagasta and extensive lands in the Atacama. The boundary between the two nations was redrawn to reflect not Bolivian interests, but Chilean conquest. In a single document, Bolivia lost its Pacific coastline. The loss was not metaphorical. On maps produced before 1879, Bolivia extended to the ocean. On maps produced after 1883, Bolivia was landlocked. The nation that had begun its existence as an independent state with maritime access had been reduced to a territorial interior, dependent on the goodwill of neighbors for any trade that required ocean passage. This was not a border adjustment. This was the erasure of a fundamental characteristic of national identity. The immediate consequence was economic strangulation. Bolivia's trade had depended on Pacific ports. Now, Bolivia had to negotiate access to ports, controlled by its former enemy. The nitrate revenues that might have funded national development flowed instead to Santiago. Bolivia faced the prospect of permanent economic disadvantage, locked into the interior of the continent, cut off from the primary trade routes that connected South America to global markets. But the loss was deeper than economics. The psychological impact of losing the sea resonated through Bolivian society with a force that statistics could not capture. The ocean had represented possibility, connection to the world beyond the Andes, access to the wider hemisphere. Its loss represented limitation, enclosure, subordination to neighbors who now controlled the only passage to the outside. Over the following decades and into the present century, Bolivia has launched periodic diplomatic efforts to regain access to the Pacific. These efforts have been unsuccessful. Chile has maintained the territorial gains it secured in 1883 and has shown no willingness to reverse them. Peru has mediated at various points, but has never offered to cede territory to Bolivia. The landlocked status has become permanent, not as the result of geographical accident, but as the result of war and the treaties that followed. The Treaty of Ancon also included a provision, later amended, that granted Bolivia temporary access to Chilean ports for trade. This concession was precisely what it appeared to be, a mechanism to prevent Bolivia from becoming an outright liability to Chile, to allow trade to continue in a framework that Chile controlled absolutely. Bolivia could use Chilean ports, but only on terms set by Chile. This was not sovereignty. This was the condition of the defeated. The war that lasted 4 years had reshaped the political geography of South America. Bolivia lost not only territory, but also regional influence. The nation that might have been a coastal power became a continental inland state, relegated to secondary status in hemispheric affairs. Bolivia's inability to project power toward the Pacific left it vulnerable to other interventions and unable to influence the resolution of other regional disputes. The generations that followed the Treaty of Ancón inherited a nation defined by absence. They inherited maps that showed what had been lost. They inherited the memory of a coastline that was no longer theirs. They inherited a deficit that would shape national identity for centuries to come. What had begun as a dispute over nitrate deposits had become a permanent reorganization of territory and power. The war itself had ended. The treaty had been signed. But the consequence of the war persisted, embedded now in the basic geography of the nation, in the presence of the Andes barrier between Bolivia and the sea, in the requirement that every Bolivian export destined for global markets had to cross international borders over which Bolivia exercised no control. This was the payoff of 4 years of conflict. This was what remained when the armies departed and the diplomats returned home. A nation that had lost not a battle, but its access to the ocean, and with it, a fundamental characteristic of its place in the world. The decades following the treaty revealed the true weight of what Bolivia had surrendered. The temporary access to Chilean ports that the treaty promised became a hollow provision almost immediately. Chile controlled the terms. Chile controlled the timing. Bolivia found itself dependent on the goodwill of the nation that had defeated it, negotiating for the right to move its own goods through corridors it could not defend. The arrangement lasted only as long as Chile found it politically convenient to maintain it. By the turn of the century, Bolivia had begun to understand the full architecture of its isolation. Every ton of tin extracted from the high plateaus had to travel overland through Peru or Chile to reach a port. Every agricultural product bound for European markets faced tariffs imposed by neighbors. Every industrial ambition required passage through foreign territory. The landlocked condition transformed from temporary disadvantage into permanent structural constraint. It was not merely the loss of a coastline, it was the loss of economic autonomy. The memory of the Pacific, however, never fully receded. Bolivian schoolchildren learned geography through maps that showed the lost territory in different colors, a visual reminder of what had been taken. Historians began to reconstruct the war through different lenses, asking not whether Bolivia could have won, but where exactly the chain of choices had broken. The questions multiplied. What if the alliance with Peru had held? What if Bolivia had secured support from Argentina? What if the early diplomatic efforts had succeeded in limiting the conflict to territorial negotiation rather than allowing it to become total war? These questions produced a particular kind of national consciousness. Bolivia developed what historians would later call a geographic melancholy, an awareness of absence so constant that it became woven into national identity itself. The country was defined not by what it possessed, but by what it lacked. This was different from other territorial losses in history. This was not a distant colony or a frontier region. This was the literal connection to the world ocean, the fundamental medium of global commerce and communication. The consequences extended far beyond sentiment. Landlocked status imposed measurable economic costs. Shipping goods internationally required paying intermediaries in other nations. Infrastructure investment flowed toward roads and rail connections that crossed borders, creating dependencies that persisted for generations. Bolivia could not compete equally with coastal nations on global markets. The price advantage that could be gained by controlling one's own port facilities, by managing export logistics, by building independent commercial relationships with distant trading partners. All of these advantages accrued to other nations. Regional geopolitics shifted in ways that reinforced Bolivia's isolation. Chile emerged from the war as the dominant Pacific power on the western coast of South America. Peru, though defeated alongside Bolivia, retained northern access to the ocean and could gradually restore its position. Argentina, never directly engaged in the conflict, consolidated control of the southern cone. Bolivia sat in the middle of the continent, surrounded by nations that controlled ocean access, each one a potential gatekeeper for Bolivian commerce. Attempts to remedy the situation emerged throughout the 20th century, each one ultimately unsuccessful. Bolivia pursued diplomatic negotiations with Chile repeatedly, seeking either restoration of territory or guaranteed access to ports. The responses were consistent. Chile had no incentive to diminish its own advantages. Bolivia appealed to international bodies, to the League of Nations, later to the United Nations, arguing that the war had been unjust and the treaty illegitimate. These appeals registered as historical complaints, nothing more. Territory, once lost through warfare, rarely returned through legal argument. The most persistent effort came through Bolivia's relationship with Peru. Since Peru itself had territory adjacent to the Pacific and a historical claim to portions of the Atacama region, some Bolivian strategists theorized that Peru might eventually agree to cede a corridor or permit Bolivia to construct port facilities on Peruvian territory. Negotiations proceeded at intervals throughout the 20th century. Peru remained non-committal. The Peruvian government faced its own domestic pressures and territorial disputes. Committing to grant Bolivia ocean access would have required expending political capital that Peru preferred to preserve for other purposes. Bolivia's economy adapted to landlocked reality, but adaptation was not the same as overcoming it. The nation became known for tin mining, for natural gas extraction, for agricultural products from the high plateaus. These industries developed, but they developed under the structural constraint of requiring international transit for export. Every major economic sector operated within the geography that the war had imposed. There was no way to escape it. There was no alternative route to development that bypassed the necessity of crossing borders. The mid-20th century brought new ideological frameworks through which Bolivians could interpret their historical loss. Marxist analysis suggested that the war had been an expression of capitalist competition for resources, that Bolivia had been victimized by imperialism, that the entire territorial reorganization of South America reflected the logic of colonial extraction. These frameworks provided explanation and a language for grievance, but they did not alter facts. Bolivia remained landlocked. The Andes remained between Bolivia and the sea. The 1952 Bolivian Revolution attempted a comprehensive reimagining of national identity and economic structure. Land reform redistributed agricultural holdings. Mining was nationalized. The government pursued policies intended to reduce dependency on foreign powers and foreign markets. Even with these transformations, the basic geographic reality persisted. The revolution could not move mountains. It could not create a coastline where none existed. It could not nullify the treaties that had formalized Bolivia's isolation. Generations grew up knowing only the landlocked condition. For them, it was not loss, but the natural state. They learned national history, and within that history, they learned the story of the war and the treaty. Some accepted it as inevitable tragedy. Others carried a persistent sense of injustice, a feeling that a wrong had been done that had never been adequately addressed. Others simply navigated the practical challenges of living in a nation without direct ocean access, solving problems day by day without reference to historical grievance. The infrastructure that developed reflected this landlocked reality. Major cities in Bolivia grew in the interior: La Paz, Cochabamba, Sucre, distant from any border. When railroads were built, they were designed to connect these interior centers to neighboring nations' ports, rather than to develop internal systems that might have accessed the ocean directly. Every major transportation network pointed outward, toward exits, toward other nations' facilities. Bolivia's infrastructure became a map of its dependence. By the final decades of the 20th century, Bolivia's landlocked status had achieved a kind of historical permanence. It was no longer a recent wound or an active diplomatic crisis. It was simply the condition within which Bolivian politics, economics, and society operated. The war that had produced this condition had faded from living memory. The diplomats and generals who had negotiated the treaty were long deceased. The nations that had fought, Peru, Chile, Bolivia, had moved through multiple governments, multiple ideological systems, multiple economic structures. Yet the geography remained unchanged. The maps remained unchanged. Bolivia's borders still ended at lines that did not touch an ocean. The Andes still rose between the nation and the Pacific. The treaties that had formalized this arrangement still existed in archives, their terms still technically binding, their consequences still visible in the structure of continental trade. The landlocked condition had become so fundamental to Bolivia's existence that it was difficult to imagine the nation any other way. But the reminder persisted. On maps of South America, Bolivia's position within the continent, its interior location, the fact that travelers or goods leaving Bolivia had to cross international borders to reach the sea, all of this was a daily, material reminder of something that had happened 100 years earlier, when armies fought and diplomats negotiated and decisions were made that proved irreversible. What remained was not primarily a question of how to recover what had been lost. The practical mechanisms for doing so had proven ineffective across more than a century of effort. What remained instead was the fact of loss itself, embedded in geography, confirmed by treaties, expressed in every economic transaction that required transit through a neighboring nation, visible on every map that showed Bolivia as a landlocked nation surrounded by other territories, cut off from the world ocean that connected continents and enabled commerce and projected power. This was the final consequence of the war that had lasted 4 years. The armies had disbanded. The treaties had been signed. The generations of those who fought had passed. But the consequence persisted, materialized now not in conflict, but in infrastructure, in trade patterns, in the basic structure of how a nation existed in relation to the global system. Bolivia had been born with a Pacific coastline. 4 years of war had taken it away, and in the century that followed, nothing had restored it. Nothing had changed the fundamental fact of the nation's landlocked condition. This was what remained when all the other consequences had faded, a nation cut off from the sea, defined by absence, living within the geography that war had imposed.